Good morning, good evening to everybody. I am Janie Lazar, and I have conversations with people that I feel need to be heard. Over recent times, I've become involved with the deaf community, and I've come to realize that there are two very distinctive parts of the deaf community: the deaf community and CODA. CODA, children of deaf adults. What I've realized is I thought I knew something, not very much, but I realize I know nothing. Hence me starting to have conversations with people like Paul. Paul, you are very welcome here. Thank you for giving me the time today.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Well, I know it's going to be a really useful conversation because people like me dance a very fine line between, if you like, being embarrassed, not knowing quite what to do when we, as if you like, in the hearing world, encounter deaf people and want to get to know them, but we're always terribly frightened of getting it wrong. And the instinct then is to hide, or as I've learned, my first words are always "I'm sorry," because I just don't know how to do this. So this series of conversations is very much to help further understanding, to help people like me do it better. So who knows where this conversation is going to go? But you are a man who's made an incredible difference to the world of coders. If I can just take you back to, goodness, a little bit about your upbringing,
Sure.
because you grew up as a hearing person with deaf parents. So just tell me a bit about what position that put you in. If you like, I see it very much as a dance, maybe between two worlds.
Well, it's interesting. And I think this is maybe true for a lot of codas that it's often only when we step outside of our families that we realize that there's something different about our families and us. That, the thing that I think is important about deaf culture and codas who grow up in with deaf culture is that deafness is perfectly normal. It's not this odd, strange thing. It's part of our lives. I think for myself, growing up, um, I was lucky that I grew up. I was an only child. Grew up in a very small town, 101 people, and my parents were the only deaf people in town. And yet my parents, um, both of them were fairly comfortable having being involved in the deaf community and deaf culture, but they also had a number of hearing coworkers, hearing friends, and they too would go back and forth. So I kind of learned that pattern of when there were hearing people who know little or no sign in our house, they would take time, sometimes by writing notes, sometimes by gesturing. Um, so I kind of learned that for me that was a way forward. That in this group I can communicate this way. In this group I can communicate that way. And I think that's a really important piece to the CODA experience. But I don't think I made a whole lot out of it until I started getting older. And when I was in school, I think that's typical for a lot of CODAs, that's when they enter school, for many of them, that's the first time they're confronted with this reality that those parents can talk, they can speak, my parents can't. There's something different about my family than that family. But up until then, I think a lot of CODAs, weren't as aware of that split.
And take me a little bit further on to, I suppose, the thing that I'm struck by is the book that you wrote is held up as seminal work, if you like. It's so
Thank
highly regarded, and now that we're just coming up to the 25th anniversary of Mother Father Death.
Yes, I'm an old man now, can't you tell?
You're no longer the lad at school or uni and doing your dissertation. And what, what prompted you to write the book and to pursue that route of really taking the level of understanding of people like yourselves to another level?
Well, if you want, I mean, I've explained in other videos, in other
Mm.
interviews that I wanted to do an ethnography of CODAs. I didn't call them that at the time, but I wanted to do an ethnography of children who had grown up with deaf parents and describe their, was there something about this group of people? But that came later. I suppose the seminal moment that I came up with this whole idea was when I was in Australia. I originally was going to do my doctoral dissertation on HIV and AIDS and alternative health practices because my degree is in medical anthropology. So I was going to go to Africa. I was going to initially was almost packed and ready to go there, spend some time in a clinic. And the government in Zambia denied my visa at the time because they said, there are no AIDS cases, there are no HIV cases here, go somewhere else. So I had to scramble, and one thing led to the next, and I ended up in Sydney, Australia at a health clinic that was primarily treating AIDS patients. And so I spent 3 months there, and somewhere along the way, I went to a bar. CODAs never go to bars. I went to a bar and I saw that there was a deaf man. I don't remember exactly how, but a deaf man was there. And he and I began to talk to each other. And I think some people know that sign language is not universal, that each country almost has its own particular kind of sign language. And Aslan is fairly different than ASL. But we were talking back and forth, and then at some point, this other man came along, and he was an interpreter, not a CODA, but he came along and he saw the two of us signing, and he said something to me, and he realized that I was an American, and he said, well, how is it that you can communicate with this deaf man when you're an American and this deaf man is Australian? And he knew that the sign languages were not similar, but he said, well, how is it that you can communicate with this man? And I said, well, I don't know. It's probably because my parents are deaf. And then I started thinking about it as time went on, and I thought, well, what was that was going on? How is it that I could communicate with this man who is deaf, but who is from a different country than me, whose sign language is different than mine, and yet there was a connection. And I think that's what prompted me to sort of revise what I was going to do for my dissertation and explore, well, what is it at the heart of this this ability to interact with deaf people in a way that's different for many people. And that's kind of what I wanted to explore, because at the time, there was a very few things written about CODAs, and there's very few things that explained, well, who are these people, and do they have something in common with each other? And that's kind of what I wanted to explore.
And it's interesting you talk about the ability, and I see it very much as an how can I best describe it? Just a superb ability. It's almost like a superpower, if you like, to move between two worlds seemingly seamlessly, but also it is almost as if you're in a state of flux.
Yes, yes.
The-
Well, I think that the
It's
idea of the dance is very good,
it
uh,
is it's
because I think we experience, although again, I think that a lot of us maybe, especially as we're younger or don't have the opportunity to talk with other CODAs, don't have people that we know, that we can say, well, did you do this? Did you do that? Is that your experience? So a lot of times you're sort of doing it almost innately, naturally, going back and forth, but you're not always aware that that's what you're doing. Um, and I think that's a real key piece to helping many CODAs. And that's what I felt really good about, was helping CODAs understand that there is this shifting and dance between these two worlds. And I always caution people, CODAs, hearing people, deaf people, that, you know, there's a broad range of what the experience is. And a lot of what I wrote about was maybe typical of many CODAs, but there are CODAs who don't sign. There are CODAs who didn't have some of those same experiences, either because their parents, like many parents who speak a different language than the majority culture, they didn't want their children to know sign. They didn't use sign. And I think one of the hardest things that I listened to and wrote about was the CODAs whose parents signed, were not oral, didn't speak, but nevertheless they didn't teach their children sign language because they thought, well, that's not right. There's some negative association with it. And so that was hearing from CODAs who said, I, as an adult, still can't communicate with my own mother and father. And I think that was maybe not true of a lot of CODAs, but there were a number of CODAs for which that was true. And so I think the emphasis on pushing down the signs, no, don't sign in public, the embarrassment or the stigma, that affected a lot of families.
It's interesting, just an experience I had back in 2019, which I suppose started, it really, I suppose, opened my ears, my eyes, my heart to learning more, if you like, about the deaf and coda worlds. I was working with a deaf speaker, and we had two interpreters. One was coming from, if you like, the trained interpreter route, as in going through university, not having grown up with deaf parents, and the other was a coda. And it was just very interesting now, with the benefit of hindsight, knowing the little bit more that I know now, looking back at the interaction that we had at the time, because I certainly think now, with the benefit of hindsight, that the coda experience added immensely to the process. Because since then, I've talked at length with Catherine's help to the speaker, and what has come through is how much it meant to her to be able. It was a TED talk that she gave, and she said for the first time her father heard her,
Mm, 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 mm.
because we'd spent a lot of time working on her story, how it was to be delivered. So a lot of interaction between the three of us. So it's not, for me as a speaker coach, it's not about working with a hearing speaking person. It was quite a complex process. But for her to not be aware that somebody was her voice during her delivery, and for her father to truly hear her, and for her to feel she was heard and she was seen by him. And it was only afterwards that she said, when they spoke, he was crying.
Yeah.
And
Well, it's very touching. It's very touching, and it's one of the regrets I have, because I think like I think many CODAs, were put in a position of having to be the interpreter or the translator between their deaf parents and their hearing grandparents. And what I never got a chance to do as an adult was to sort of bridge that gap between my mother and her mother, my grandmother. I was very close to both of them, and my grandmother was not accepting at all of my mother being deaf. My mother was profoundly deaf. She was born deaf. My grandmother would always say, well, my daughter can't hear very well. And she would talk to my mother when her back was turned. And as a child, I mean, my grandmother died when I was 12, and I often was the interpreter between the two of them. But as an adult, I might try to figure out, well, how could I make that connection better? And I think that's what a lot of times CODAs struggle with is seeing, I think, seeing the pain on both sides, of seeing their pain of their parents not being accepted by their own parents, or the parents' pain, the grandparents' pain of having a deaf child. I used to be very critical of my grandmother as an adult, and writing this book. Like, well, why didn't she? How come she couldn't accept that her daughter was deaf? I mean, but it's later that I also understood the pain that she had. That she was in her early 40s when my mother was born. Her first child had died at 1 or 2 years old. And so here was this daughter who's deaf. And I think it was very hard for her to accept that. So I had to sort of back off of being so critical of my grandmother because I saw some of the difficulty that she had, maybe partially influenced by the society that said,
at the
if you're
time.
deaf, you have to speak, you have to, not sign. It's a very strong message that parents get. That in order to be normal, you have to act this way.
And yet, as a child, seeing this happening and not, it's very difficult. It must be very difficult still for children who are in that situation because that they haven't the skills to be able to maneuver, to handle the responsibility. And
Right.
certainly to have stood up to your grandmother wouldn't have been within your skill set. You wouldn't have dreamt of doing it.
Right, and a very common thing that happens to a lot of coders is that when they are out in public with their parents, uh, whether it's both parents or one parent, and they're signing, and people around them maybe are talking about them. Of course, the deaf parent maybe can't hear what they're saying, but the codas can hear what they're saying. And I think the struggle is, well, do you tell your parent what hurtful things they may be saying, like, oh, those people are really weird, what are they doing with their hands, and making fun of them, or just kind of odd off the wall things. And I think a lot of codas, especially if they're younger, they want to protect their parents. They want to say, you don't need to hear this.
Yeah, it's really giving a shortened version of what's actually happening there and processing that in your own way. And that I can only imagine how difficult that was. What advice would you give deaf parents today?
Well, the first thing I would tell them is be proud of the fact that you're deaf. That, and the second is, if you use sign language, please use sign language to communicate with your children. Because, if you use, whatever your form of communication, whether it's in America, ASL or signed English, even if you're oral, you make the effort to communicate with your child. I think, because it's sort of a cyclical process. The deaf parent who was shut out of communication with many within their own families, that they were left out of the communication loop. And they sort of often repeating that now with their children. They're worried about it. Will my hearing son or daughter, will they be abnormal? Will they be not be able to speak well? Will they fall behind in school because they're using sign? I think a lot of that has been dismissed, but it still remains a worry. When I've talked to groups of deaf parents, um, they were often very relieved to one, to hear that I was not saying, you are bad parents, you are, CODAs think they had a really terrible experience. No, the CODAs really cherished their families and their upbringing, but there was a lot of pressure from the outside world to conform to what the expectation was to be normal.
Yeah. It's a strange old world we live in, isn't it, Paul? It really is.
Yes, yes, yes. But I think it's changing. I think it's changing. I think there's a greater visibility deaf people now.
Mm.
There's a
Yeah.
lot of empowerment among deaf people, which at the same time creates some conflicts with CODAs, because I think I've written about, people have talked about, to speak for the deaf world, the deaf people, you need to be deaf. Now, what that means in terms of a CODA, it's a little more complicated.
Would you like to just expand on that a little bit? Because
Well, I think, there's been several, I think the best examples I can get are that there are a number of films that have come out within the past year. One is a film called CODA, a Hollywood produced film, which stars a non-CODA as a CODA. So that's already the question of what kind of, if you're an actor and you're not disabled, can you portray a disabled person? If you're not gay, can you portray a gay character? If you're not deaf, can you portray a deaf character? With CODAs, it's a little bit different because they are part of both worlds. And many CODAs would tell me, I'm more deaf than some deaf people, because many deaf people didn't come to sign language until later, as adolescents or even adults. They didn't experience the community of the deaf community the way a lot of CODAs do. So I think it's a tricky thing to say, well, only deaf, audiologically deaf people can speak for deaf people.
so just picking up on that last point of the film, do you think there's a responsibility for people in the media to engender greater understanding?
Yes, yes, yes. And, there's another film that just came out called The Sound of Metal. And one of the characters in the film is a CODA. He is, the story in the film, the reason he can speak as well as sign is because he was in the war, and he lost his hearing through the war. But up until then, he could speak and hear, became deaf, and now he can sign as well. Well, it kind of glosses over the fact that a CODA's experience is that they grew up with sign language, and of course they can sign and they can speak as well.
One of the films, as we're talking about films, that made the biggest impact on me was the one Mother, Father, Deaf. And to say it completely transformed what I thought I knew, what I thought I could understand, is an understatement. And I think it's a documentary that should be shown in every single school.
Yeah, yeah.
It
Well, there's a lot of attention now to
now's the
recognize
time.
recognizing bilingual, bicultural families. But of course, the typical scenario is, a family that speaks one spoken language that's different from the majority, whether they're Spanish speaking at home and English speaking in the culture, or, some combination of that. Um, But with CODAs, I think that's only beginning to kind of get out there in that way, that this is, it's comparable, but I think that maybe the difference is that CODAs kind of really are part of both worlds, and they can be as hearing, many can be as hearing people, but they can also be as deaf people.
Very true. Very. It's just something else that immediately comes to mind is somebody like you who has danced throughout your life between the two worlds. You've danced, if you like, between the world of academia, if you like, the practicality. You've given workshops, you've taught, you've retired. But I fully believe that somebody like you never retires
Yeah, yeah,
because there's a richness there. We've only had a few conversations, but I know that there is more that excites you, that you see the way technology is advancing, the way society hopefully is changing for the better.
yeah. Well,
So I what comes next?
technology is certainly helping, I think, lessen the barriers and to for deaf people, lessening the barriers to the hearing world, and maybe as part of that, that the burden, if you want, the responsibility to interpret for your parents because there's no other option. There's no captioning. There's no interpreter. There's no email or texting. It's when I was growing up, I was it. uh, and I think and I hope that there is kind of a broadening of the opportunities, and because I know it's a struggle. Again, many CODAs that I interviewed and talked with, they would acknowledge that yes, sometimes there was too much responsibility put on them, and sometimes, but at the same time, they would say, but what was the option? What were the resources? What other option was there? Um, so I think now there are more options, more resources, not always available to everyone, but I think the more people become aware and the more technology advances, I think that'll be a great thing. I think my dad, who was 100 years old, he died just 4 months ago, and he was the last. My mom died 4 years before that, and I know CODAs have talked about when their parents die, they lose a sort of a connection. They feel they lose a connection with the deaf world, the deaf community. And I sometimes feel like that. I mean, I do have deaf friends. I do interact with the deaf community, but it's different, and I don't do it very often. Um, but I still cherish the opportunity to do that.
You were very close to your father. I mean, I've read different things that
Yeah.
you wrote about that experience, and I'm very sorry for that loss because it you had such a special relationship.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I one of the things I wrote about, I started Mother, Father, Death, writing the book, and I wanted to give kind of I wanted to give readers, I wanted to give them a sense of, well, here's a range of some of the CODA's experience. So I picked three short pieces from three different CODAs. One was a man who took me to a house that his father had built, and he said, "Look at what my father did." He was very proud of his father. He he said, "Look what a deaf man can do." The second person was sort of almost the opposite. She was very angry about all the um, responsibilities she had. Do this, do that. But the third person I selected was a woman who told me, "Yeah, my mom and I have different issues at times, but what it comes down to is not just that she's deaf, she's my mother. She's my mother. And I think at the heart of it, that's another piece to it that, yes, both of our parents, one of our parents may be deaf, but at the same time, they're my father, they're my mother.
One of the things that I remember reading, you were talking about your your parents encouraging you to, if you like, join the outside world. That up until going to school, that yeah, this was the world, and it was a bilingual world. And as I say, going back to that dance, you were in that state of flux without thinking about it. It was
Yeah,
natural to you, and you didn't see any difference. It was just that that was your life,
right,
and that was the
right.
way you communicated, and that was the way the relationship, uh, the connection was made through that. But through your parents encouraging you to step out into the hearing world, and that there is another world out there, I think is advice. It's solid advice for any parent, but
Well,
particularly.
it's difficult in some ways. I remember one interview where the CODA was telling me that I can't remember exactly, either with her 18th birthday or her 21st birthday, and they went and they sat in front of a big window, and her father said to her, "Well, out there is the hearing world. It's time for you to join that world." And she said, but I'm deaf. I I don't know that much about the hearing world. I think so. The struggle to sort of figure out, well, where do you fit in? Do you fit into that world? Do you stay in this world? I think that's an ongoing struggle for many coders. I know for myself, a lot of the friends I grew up with, coders, I mean, I don't see them anymore. I'm 2,000 miles away from them. And yet, I've found a new CODA community here in California. Um, but again, the experience a lot of times is very personal. It's what my family, and I was fortunate, that both of my parents, they also were more comfortable than I think many deaf people of moving back and forth between the deaf world and the hearing world. So in a way, they kind of modeled that for me.
You've touched on one thing I'd like to really finish up on, and I think it's actually the most important, and it is that sense of identity. It's a question I think anybody has, but I think particularly when you're moving between two worlds, and it's who am I? And that's so related to the culture that surrounds you, the culture that you grow up in, the culture that of the greater community that you then become part of. And I'm just wondering, there was something in one of the articles that you kindly gave me to read, and you spoke about the paradox of ambiguous identity. Maybe we can just touch on that.
Yeah, and I think part of the issue is that it's easy to say, well, it's black or it's white, and it's not. And I think the situations and context change. I wrote the book initially. It was based on my dissertation, but I think I wrote the book for hearing people. I wanted hearing people to understand what the CODA experience was like. But I
Okay.
hadn't fully appreciated that I was also, um, helping or giving information to CODAs about what the experience was like. I deliberately, in the book, I interviewed 150 CODAs, and I chose some piece of an interview from all 150 because not every CODA is alike, but it gave them a place that they could say, well, yeah, this fits my experience, or this fits a little bit more with my experience. What I was not able to do maybe was because it was written mostly for a hearing, but in a way an academic audience, that I wasn't able to convey to deaf parents what I was talking about. And the way I could do that best was when I was talking one-on-one with deaf parents, or whether I was in a giving a lecture or giving a talk to deaf people. Then I could use signing. Then I could communicate to them in a language that they understood. So that was kind of my different sort of directions. But in terms of the ambiguity, I think that's something that doesn't get fully resolved. That it is, again, depending on context, depending on who you're talking with. When if you're in a deaf gathering and you're signing, and a lot of times deaf people won't know that you're a CODA. They would think you're deaf. Um, when you're in a hearing world and you're talking and you're speaking, they don't know that you came from a deaf family unless you tell them. And so a lot of times the what appears to be you're deaf, you're hearing, and it's really hard to, I think, for people to appreciate that there is this ambiguity, there is this paradox that keeps shifting. You're one thing in one world, you're one thing in another world, which is part of why I think so many CODAs find that the organization of CODA, or just being together with other CODAs, is an opportunity to explore that particular experience rather than just all about deafness or all about hearing. But it's this odd mixture that is fluid and keeps changing.
Yeah. I mean, it really is. I think everybody struggles to really know who they are. And the question I always have is who is what you do who you are? Or is who you are more about how you do what you do? And I love that the description that you have there is that when coders are amongst coders, they can simply be, because there's no need to explain it. It's just there. It's you're at home.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, I think people sometimes people, if they're not CODAs, they would be a little surprised that, because when CODAs are with each other, sometimes they will talk and communicate in spoken language. Sometimes they will sign and not talk at all. Sometimes they'll go back and forth, and it's sort of I think some people refer to it as CODA talk, which is this kind of interesting blend of the two. And what's interesting to me is that it actually, in a lot of ways, is very consistent among CODAs, that they use this combination, broken signing, speaking, in a very similar way.
Which to me simply demonstrates the richness of being a coder, and
Right.
the richness that coders can bring into, if you like, my world,
Yeah.
and to help me understand more. So I suppose the final question, Paul, is for people like me who really do want to be, if you like, an ally. That's the best word that I can describe for it. I don't know that I've got the ability to learn how to sign effectively. I'm considering different things. I'm trying different things, but I'm not doing terribly well so far. What would your advice be for people like me who, if you like, whilst coders are dancing the dance between the two worlds as a coder, for people like me who are dancing on a different periphery, what advice would you give me and people like
Well,
me?
I think one is to be genuine, to be real about your reluctance or your fear, or whether it's embarrassment or lack of skill. That being genuine and being who you are and putting forth, I think, gets you a lot further. I mean, I know people who struggle with learning sign language. In fact, some people I know, they'll focus on just their hands. And I would say, well, it's about your whole body. It's your whole face. It's all of you. That's an expression of who you are. And again, I look at my parents. Some of their friends who were hearing could fingerspell. Some of them couldn't fingerspell or sign at all, but they would write notes. Sometimes they would gesture, but they would make the effort. And I think that's sort of the first piece. And the other is just sort of acknowledging where these people are coming from. That again, CODAs, and I'm always reluctant to give hard and fast rules about, well, you do this and you do that, because there's a diversity of experiences. I was listening to a woman because of the recent shooting massacres in the United States and against Asian Americans. And one woman who was Asian, I believe she was Korean American, she said, well, I can't speak for all Asians, I can't speak for all Koreans, I can just tell you my experience. And I think that's maybe something to just keep in mind, that when you meet a deaf person, when you meet a CODA, you may have a sense of what their experience are, but maybe it's very different for them, and just being open to that.
So just engage, be yourself,
Yeah.
do it, engage with good intention, and see what
Yeah,
happens.
yeah, because my experience is that so many deaf people are very willing and very forgiving
Yeah.
about people who are trying to communicate with them, even if they don't know, if they're not skilled in sign language, if they're not very skilled at all, they know no sign language. But it's that effort, it's that willingness to communicate, because communication is sort of at the heart of all this. It's what I think can be the biggest barrier, but it can open up so many doors.
It can, and you're absolutely right. w- I like the analogy that you draw with languages, because I, j- how can I put it? Anytime I go to Italy, my Italian is absolutely appalling. It's baby Italian.
I know that. I know that for myself.
But because I make baby steps, because I try and I really want to learn, I'm welcome with open arms. We get there. Whereas in other countries that have a Latin-based language, it's not always been so easy over the years. But I just think it is. If the intention to connect is there,
Yeah, yeah.
then it makes it much easier.
I just find that people, whether it's a deaf or just a different language base, that if you make the effort and you're sincere about it, that so many people are so forgiving and welcoming the opportunity.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to carry on doing exactly what I'm doing. You've given me great insights, and I really do look forward to more conversations with you because you add a richness. You add a richness to my learning, and I know that as we go on and have more conversations, you're going to add richness to what we're doing. Catherine and I are beginning to do here in Ireland. So, Paul, thank you hugely.
Oh, great. I really enjoyed this conversation because one of the things that I've traveled a lot based on my book, traveled to Brazil and Japan and China and Spain and, many different countries, Italy. Uh, and I wish I had more of an opportunity to explore those CODA's experiences, which I know are different in some ways than American CODAs. I mean, that was my focus at the time. And at the same time, I know that from talking with CODAs from all over the world, that we still, despite our spoken language differences, still have an underlying sense of what it means to have grown up with deaf parents.
I sense an international research project coming on, and I think we might have to collaborate.
That's right. I'm open.
Thank you very much.
You're
And
welcome. Thank you.
thank you
Thank you.
to you as well. Thank you. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you.
Till the next time.